Article 1326. Advertisements for bidders are simply invitations to make proposals, and the advertiser is not bound to accept the highest or lowest bidder unless the contrary appears. Advertisements for bidders generally not definite offers. In an advertisement for bidders, the advertiser is not the one making the offer. In reality, the bidder is the one making the offer, which the advertiser is free to accept or reject. Acceptance by the advertiser of a given bid is necessary for a contract to exist between the advertiser and the bidder, regardless of the terms and conditions of his bid. As a general rule, the advertiser is not bound to accept the highest bidder, as when the offer is to buy, or the lowest bidder, as when the offer is to construct a building, unless the contrary appears. In judicial sales, however, the sheriff or auctioneer is bound to accept the highest bid.
Article 1327. The following cannot give consent to a contract: 1. Unemancipated minors; 2. Insane or demented persons and deaf mutes who do not know how to write. Persons incapacitated to consent: A. Unemancipated minors; B. Insane or demented persons unless they acted during a lucid interval; drunks and those hypnotized; C. Deaf mutes who do not know how to read and write. Note: if they know how to read but do not know how to write, it is submitted that the contract is valid, for then they are capable of understanding and therefore capacitated to give consent. Reason for disqualification: a contract where one of the parties is incapable of giving consent to a contract is voidable. The reason is that these kind of persons mentioned can easily be the victims of fraud, as they are not capable of understanding or knowing the nature of their actions. People who contract must know what they are entering into. Unemancipated minors. These are the persons who have not yet reached the age of majority and are still subject to parental authority. A minor can be emancipated by marriage, attainment of the age of majority, or by parental or judicial authority. Note: if a minor gets married, they will no longer be called minors. For example, May, who is 16 years old, and John, who is 17 years old, decided to get married because they feel that they are meant for each other. What can you say about this contract? A contract entered by an unemancipated person is considered voidable, but in this case, both of them are minors, so this contract is now unenforceable. Insane or demented persons. The insanity must exist at the time of contracting, unless proved otherwise, a person is presumed sane. B. Even if a person had already been declared insane, this does not necessarily mean that at the time of contracting, said person was still insane. Deaf mutes who do not know how to write and read. A. These are persons who are deaf and dumb. Formerly, a deaf mute was presumed to be an idiot. B. If a deaf mute does not know how to write, but he knows how to read, he should be considered capacitated. Persons specially disqualified. These are people who are specially disqualified in certain things. Here, the transaction is void because the right itself is restricted. That is, the right is withheld. For example, Ariana and Dan are celebrating their silver wedding anniversary. During the celebration, Dan donated a vacation house in Baguio to Ariana as a grand gesture of love and as a gift to her. As a general rule, the husband and wife cannot sell to each other, nor can they donate to each other. Every donation or grant of gratuitous advantage, direct or indirect, between the spouses during the marriage shall be void, except for modern gifts. Violations are considered void contracts, but only those prejudice can assail the validity of transaction. Article 1328. Contracts entered into during a lucid interval are valid. Contracts agreed to in a state of drunkenness or during a hypnotic spell are voidable. Lucid intervals is a temporary period of sanity. Even if a person has already been judicially declared insane and is actually now under guardianship, he may still enter into a valid contract, provided that it can be shown that at the time of contracting he was in a lucid interval. Of course, here he is already presumed insane and therefore the sanity must be proved. Effect of drunkenness and hypnotic spell. These conditions are equivalent to temporary insanity, for it impairs the capacity of a person to give intelligent consent. Hence, the law considers the contract voidable, and it is not required that such state was procured by circumvention of the other party.
Article 1329. The incapacity declared in Article 1327 is subject to modifications determined by law and is understood to be without prejudice to special disqualifications established in the laws. This article is an exception to Article 1327, wherein in certain cases the incapacity of those stated in the said article may be modified by law, that is, they may give a valid consent. Thus, when necessaries such as food are sold and delivered to a minor or other persons without the capacity to act, he must pay a reasonable price therefor. A minor 18 years old or above may contract for life, health, and accident insurance, provided the insurance is taken on his life and the beneficiary appointed is the minor's estate or the minor's direct family. A contract is valid when entered through a guardian or legal representative, a minor misrepresented his age and convincingly led the other party to believe in his legal capacity, a minor between the ages of 18 and 21 voluntarily pays a sum of money or delivers a fungible thing in fulfillment of his obligations thereunder, and the obligee has spent or consumed it in good faith. Example: Theo, a 15-year-old, was able to convince Luis, a 20-year-old, that he, Theo, is of legal age, so they both entered into a contract. The contract and consent made by Theo and Luis would be considered valid, since Theo was able to convince and make Luis believe in his legal capacity. Article 1329 also states that under the rules of the court, the following are considered incompetent and may be placed under guardianship: persons suffering the accessory penalty civil interdiction, hospitalized lepers, prodigals or spendthrifts, deaf and dumb who are unable to read and write, those who are of unsound mind even if they have lucid intervals, those who by reason of age, disease, weak mind, and other similar causes cannot without outside aid take care of themselves and manage their property, becoming thereby an easy prey for deceit and exploitations. Article 1330. A contract where consent is given through mistake, violence, intimidation, undue influence, or fraud is voidable. This article talks about the validity and the vices of consent. There is no valid consent unless it is intelligent, the capacity to act. It is free and voluntary, not by reason of violence or intimidation. It is conscious or spontaneous, not by the reason of mistake, undue influence, or fraud. Vices of consent. This renders consent defective so as to make the contract voidable. Mistake or error, intimidation or threat or duress, fraud or deceit, undue influence, violence, or force. Example: Jack and Jill went on a drinking session. By the time Jill became drunk, Jack asked Jill if she would like to buy his car. Jill agrees. The consent Jill gave to Jack would make the contract voidable, since Jill was not of sound mind, drunk.
Article 1331. In order that mistake may invalidate consent, it should refer to the substance of the thing which is the object of the contract. or to those conditions which have principally moved one or both parties to enter into the contract. Mistake as to the identity or qualifications of one of the parties will vitiate consent only when such identity or qualifications have been the principal cause of the contract. A simple mistake of account shall give rise to its correction. What is the meaning of mistake or error? Mistake or error is the false notion of a thing or a fact material to the contract. Nature of mistake. Number 1. Mistake may be of fact or of law. In general, the mistake to which this article refers is mistake of fact. It may arise from ignorance or lack of knowledge. Number 2. The mistake contemplated by law is substantial mistake of fact. That is, the party would have never given his consent had he known of the mistake. Hence, not every mistake will vitiate consent and make a contract voidable. Number 3. The mistake may be unilateral, when only one party is mistaken about a material fact, or bilateral or mutual, when both parties are in error. Generally, a person who makes mistake cannot avoid liability to the innocent party unless he shows that he was free of fault or negligence. Mistake of fact to which law refers. In order that mistake may vitiate consent, it must refer to the substance of the thing which is the object of the contract, or those conditions which have principally moved one or both parties to enter into the contract, or the identity or qualifications of one of the contracting parties provided the same was the principal cause of the contract. Mistake of fact which does not vitiate consent. Number 1. Error as regards the incidents of a thing or accidental qualities thereof, not taken as principal consideration of the contract, does not vitiate consent, unless the error is caused by fraud of the other party. Number 2. Mistake as to quantity or amount does not also vitiate consent, but only gives rise to its correction, unless it goes to the essence of the contract. Number 3. Error as regards the motives of the contract does not also vitiate consent, unless the motives constitute a condition or cause of the contract. Number 4. Mistake as regards the identity or qualifications of a party does not vitiate consent, for the reason that contracts are entered into more in consideration of the things or services which form their subject matter rather than of persons. The exception is when such identity or qualifications have been the principal cause of the contract, as in contracts which have for their object obligations to do, requiring personal qualifications of the debtor, or involving trust and confidence, such as contracts of partnership, agency, comodatum, guarantee deposit, etc. And number 5, error which could have been avoided by the party alleging it, or which refers to a fact known to him, or which he should have known by the exercise of ordinary diligence, or which is so patent and obvious that nobody could have made it, will not invalidate consent. Examples. Number 1. Mistake regarding object. A is buying from B a breeding cow, but B is selling a barren cow. Number 2. Mistake regarding condition of the contract. A is selling his parcel of land for 200,000 pesos cash, but B is buying the land thinking that the price is payable in installments. Number 3. Mistake regarding identity or qualifications. Case 1. A sold his car to B. A thought that B, who is a lawyer, was a doctor. The mistake here is not material, as to avoid the contract. Case 2. A donated his car to B. A thought that B was his half-brother. It turned out that B is not related to A. The mistake as to the identity of B in this case is material, because his identity was the principal reason or consideration for the donation. Number 4. Mistake which could have been avoided. S was willing to sell his share of 2 parcels of land, provided that his co-owners would also sell their respective shares of the said land. S engaged the services of lawyer L without knowing that L was also representing B, the prospective buyer. L confirmed to S that all her co-owners were amenable to sell their shares. After S signed the deed of sale drafted by L, he learned that the other co-owners did not agree to sell their shares over the subject property. S cannot invoke mistake in order to annul the sale, because he could have avoided the alleged mistake had she exerted efforts to verify from her co-owners if they really consented to sell their respective shares. Effect of mistake of account. Number 1. Where mistake simple. A simple mistake of account or calculation does not avoid a contract, because it does not affect its essential requisites. The defect is merely in the computation of the account or amount which can be corrected. Number 2. Where mistake gross. Where the mistake was so gross that it was clearly apparent to one party, and therefore would be impossible to escape his notice, said party cannot avoid liability on the ground of mistake in computation. Examples. For number 1, S sold to B a parcel of land with an area of 567 square meters at 415 pesos per square meter. In the document of sale, the purchase price stated is 285,305 pesos, when it should be 235,305 pesos. The mistake will not make the contract voidable. It will only give rise to its correction by putting the true amount. For number 2, in the same example, if the purchase price agreed upon is for a lump sum of 235,305 pesos for the parcel of land stated as having an area of 567 square meters, but with an actual area of only 467 square meters, B has the right to ask for the rescission or cancellation of the contract.
Article 1332. When one of the parties is unable to read, or if the contract is in a language not understood by him, and mistake or fraud is alleged, the person enforcing the contract must show that the terms thereof have been fully explained to the former. This article is an exception to the presumption that a person who signs a document has full knowledge and understanding of the contents of the same. The article states a situation where one of the parties is unable to read, or if the contract is in a language not understood by him, and in case there is alleged fraud or mistake. It is incumbent upon the party enforcing the contract to prove that the terms of the contract have been fully explained to the other party.
Article 1333. There is no mistake if the party, alleging it knew the doubt, contingency, or risk affecting the object of the contract. It is to be assumed here that the party was willing to take the risk, and he cannot therefore claim mistake because he or she knew beforehand the doubt, contingency, or risk affecting the object of the contract. This is essentially true where the contract is aleatory in nature. Example, Arlen bought a pen which was represented as it can be used to write even underwater. Arlen also knew that the pen's ability was questionable, and yet Arlen bought said pen. Here, Arlen cannot allege mistake since she knew beforehand of the doubt, risk, or contingency affecting the object of the contract. Article 1334. Mutual error as to the legal effect of an agreement when the real purpose of the parties is frustrated may vitiate consent. Requisites for Article 1334. For the article to apply, the following requisites must be present. First, the error must be mutual. Second, it must be as to the legal effect of an agreement. And lastly, it must frustrate the real purpose of the parties. Example, Fermin and Nicholas entered into a written contract affecting the land belonging to Fermin for a consideration of 500,000 pesos. At the time the contract was entered into, Fermin thought that he was given 500,000 pesos by Nicholas for the mortgage of his land. Nicholas, on the other hand, thought that by giving Fermin 500,000 pesos, he had purchased the land. The contract here is voidable because there is no meeting of minds between Fermin and Nicholas and can be annulled in court. However, if there has been meeting of minds as the object of the contract, the proper remedy is reformation of the instrument.
Article 1335. There is violence when, in order to wrest consent, serious or irresistible force is employed. There is intimidation when one of the contracting parties is compelled by a reason and well-grounded fear of an imminent and grave evil upon his person or property, or upon the person or property of his spouse, descendants, or ascendants, to give his consent. To determine the degree of the intimidation, the age, sex, and condition of the person shall be borne in mind. A threat to enforce one's claim through competent authority, if the claim is just or legal, does not vitiate consent. Nature of violence or force. Violence requires the employment of physical force. Nature of intimidation or threat. For intimidation to vitiate the consent of a party to a contract, the following requisites must be present. 1. It must produce a reasonable and well-grounded fear of an evil. 2. The evil must be imminent and grave. 3. The evil must be upon his person or property, or that of his spouse, descendants, or ascendants. And lastly, it is the reason why he enters into the contract. Intimidation need not resort to physical force. Intimidation is eternal, while violence is external. Factors to determine the degree of intimidation: whether or not the fear is reasonable and well-grounded, or the evil imminent and grave, depends upon the circumstances, including the age, sex, and condition of the person.
Article 1336. Violence or intimidation shall annul the obligation, although it may have been employed by a third person who did not take part of the contract. Violence or intimidation may be employed by a third person who did not take part in the contract. However, to make the contract voidable or annullable, it is necessary that the violence or intimidation must be of the character required in Article 1335. It is necessary that the party employing violence must be serious and is applying irresistible force. Article 1337. There is undue influence when a person takes improper advantage of his power over the will of another, depriving the latter of a reasonable freedom of choice.
The following circumstances shall be considered: the confidential, family, spiritual, and other relations between the parties, or the fact that the person alleged to have been unduly influenced was suffering from mental weakness or was ignorant or in financial distress. Undue influence is an influence of a kind that so overpowers the mind of a party as to prevent him from acting understandingly and voluntarily to do what he would have done if he had been left to exercise freely his own judgment and discretion. The circumstances to be taken into consideration mostly deal with the relationship of the party involving trust and confidence. In some instances, the guilty party has somehow moral ascendancy over the aggrieved party. While Leon is seeking to eject Terry for failure to pay her rent, Terry is in need of 5,000 pesos to pay his landlord, Leon. Terry tries to borrow from Charlie. Charlie instead tells him to sell her piano for 5,000 pesos. Terry has no one to turn to for assistance. If Terry does not want to sell the piano but she is compelled to sell it because of her financial condition, the sale may be voided on the ground of undue influence.
Article 1338. There is fraud when through insidious words or machinations of one of the contracting parties, the other is induced to enter a contract which, without them, he would not have agreed to. Causal fraud or dolo causante is the fraud committed by one party before or at the time of the celebration of the contract to secure the consent of the other. It is the fraud used by a party to induce the other to enter into a contract without which the latter would not have agreed to. Causal fraud may be committed through insidious words or machinations or by concealment. Insidious words or machinations include any misinterpretation in words or actions done with a fraudulent purpose. If the fraud did not have the effect of causal fraud, that is, it did not by itself alone cause the other contracting party to give his consent, it gave rise only to an action for damages. Requisites. First, there must be misinterpretation or concealment by a party prior to or simultaneous to the consent or creation of the contract. Second, it must be serious. Third, it must have been employed by only one of the contracting parties. Fraud committed by a third person does not vitiate consent unless it was practiced in connivance with or at least with the knowledge of the favored contracting party. Fourth, it must be made in bad faith or with intent to deceive the other contracting party who had no knowledge of the fraud. Fifth, it must have induced the consent of the other contracting party. And sixth, it must be alleged and proved by clear and convincing evidence. Example: Snow induced White to buy a ring which Snow claimed was made of pure gold. However, Snow knew all along that the ring was only gold-plated. White can have the contract annulled on the ground of fraud. Article 1339. Failure to disclose facts when there is duty to reveal them, as when the parties are bound by confidential relations, constitutes fraud. A neglect or failure to communicate that which a party to a contract knows and ought to communicate constitutes concealment. In this case, concealment is equivalent to misinterpretation. Silence or concealment by itself does not constitute fraud. The concealment contemplated in this article presupposes a purpose or design to hide facts which the other party ought to know. The injured party is entitled to cancel or annul a contract whether the failure to disclose the material facts is intentional or unintentional, as long as there is a duty to reveal or disclose them, or according to good faith, such disclosure should be made and the other party is misled or deceived in entering into the contract. If the failure is unintentional, the basis of the action for annulment is not fraud, but mistake or error. If intentional and there is no duty to make the disclosure, the parties are bound by their contract. Example: A and B are partners in a real estate business. During the existence of the partnership, A met X, who told A that he was interested in buying a large tract of land. A did not inform B about X's proposal. Instead, he persuaded B to sell his share in the partnership to him. After A became the sole owner of the business, he sold the real property to X, realizing a huge profit. The contract between A and B for the sale of B's interest is voidable on the ground of fraud. A was duty bound to disclose the proposal of X to B, since as partners, they are bound by trust and confidence.
Article 1340. Article 1340. The usual exaggeration and trade when the other party has an opportunity to know the facts are not in themselves fraudulent. It is natural for merchants and traders to exaggerate in order for them to make a sale at the highest price possible, given that the person dealing with them had an opportunity to know the facts of the object are not in themselves fraudulent. Customers are expected to rely on their own independent judgments and take care of their own concerns. Hence, anyone who relies on the exaggeration does so at his own peril. In effect, the law does not consider these exaggerations as amounting to fraud, despite it being false. That will affect the validity of the contract. To constitute for fraud, the misrepresentation must be of a fact, past or present, and not a mere expression of an opinion. Article 1341. A mere expression of an opinion does not signify fraud, unless made by an expert and the other party has relied on the former's special knowledge. In order for it to amount to fraud, the following requisites must be present. First, it must be made by an expert. Second, the other contracting party has relied on the expert's opinion. And third, the opinion turned out to be false or erroneous.
Article 1342. In case of misrepresentation by a third person, unless such misrepresentation has created substantial mistake and the same is mutual. Consent will likewise be vitiated if the third person connived with a party to the contract in making the misrepresentation. For example, Zamiel wants to buy the land of Jandrik because he is interested in putting up a factory. However, Jandrik and Zamiel do not know the classification of the area where the land is located. So, they consult Ali, a third person who tells them that the land is situated in an industrial area. Jandrik and Zamiel thus proceed with the sale. Later, however, Zamiel finds out that he could not put up a factory because the land is situated in a residential area. Is the contract between Jandrik and Zamiel voidable? Although generally, misrepresentation by a third person does not affect the validity of the contract, the contract in this case is voidable because the misrepresentation by Ali, a third person, has created a substantial mistake that is mutual. Article 1343. If the misrepresentation was made in good faith, however, the same may constitute error. For example, Zamiel has a ring which he honestly believes is adorned with diamond. He offers to sell the ring to Jandrik, telling Jandrik that the gemstone is diamond. Jandrik buys the ring, believing it to be so. Later, he discovers that the gemstone is emerald. No fraud exists here because Zamiel was in good faith. However, Jandrik may annul the contract on the ground of mistake.
Article 1344. In order that fraud may make a contract voidable, it should be serious and should not have been employed by both contracting parties. Incidental fraud only obliges the person employing it to pay damages. Article 1344 distinguishes two kinds of civil fraud in the making of a contract. One is the causal fraud, which is a ground for the annulment of a contract, although it may also give rise to an action for damages. In order that causal fraud may vitiate consent, first, it should be serious, second, it should not have been employed by both contracting parties, and lastly, it should not have been known by the other contracting party. The other fraud stated in Article 1344 is the incidental fraud. Incidental fraud only renders the party who employs it liable for damages because the fraud was not the principal inducement that led the other to give his consent. Thus, incidental fraud do not vitiate consent.
Article 1345. Simulation of a contract may be absolute or relative. The former takes place when the parties do not intend to be bound at all. The latter, when the parties conceal their true agreement. Article 1346. An absolutely simulated or fictitious contract is void. A relative simulation, when it does not prejudice a third person and is not intended for any purpose contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy, binds the parties to the real agreement. Simulation of the contract is the deliberate act of making a fictitious agreement by the parties for the purpose of deception, when in fact the juridical act that appears on the contract does not really exist or different from what is actually agreed upon. Simulation takes place when the parties do not really want the contract they have executed to produce the legal effects expressed by its wordings. Kinds of simulated contracts. 1. Absolute simulation. 2. Relative simulation. Absolute simulation is one where the parties do not intend to be bound by the contract. It is not really intended to produce any legal effect, nor does it alter the juridical situation of the parties. Example, in the sale of a fish pond, it was made to appear that the price was paid, but in fact it was not. The sale, being without consent, is fictitious. Relative simulation is one where the parties conceal their real agreement by disguising it under another contract. Example, a donor is donating a property to a donee. Instead of executing a deed of donation, the donor instead executed a deed of sale to conceal the donation intended. Thank you for watching. Keep safe, everyone.